In this, the final main session of new content, called Work, Class and Gender, we take on material that is aimed primarily at Assessment 2. In the opening PowerPoints, I stress what is called a relational approach. I won't go through that in great detail, but it is actually quite straightforward. It argues that no one element is necessarily more important than another, so the economic has to be put beside other areas such as the social, the cultural, the political. And the transformational approach, which we looked at in the first session, does support this. So PowerPoints 3, 4, 5 and 6 all bring out the elements of the relational approach. The other body of theory that supports such a relational approach is that of feminist philosophy. And feminist approaches will be some of those that will be particularly important as we look at social divisions. One of the areas that we clearly have to consider is that globalisation and its effects and outcomes on people's lives may mean that many workers are degraded and rendered not fit for high-level work, not by anything that they've done, but by the fact that markets and hence employers have created strategies that actually exclude rather than include. You will see in PowerPoint 5 a definition by the sociologist Manuel Castells, and that is one that is relevant here. It reads, a relational approach that enables a social actor to influence asymmetrically the decisions of other social actors in ways that favour the empowered actor's will, interests and values. So that there is always a reciprocal but asymmetrical relation between either groups or between people. They're never not in relationship with each other. I use the term reciprocal, but doesn't mean that in this case that it is equal, merely that the relations take account of each other. They may in fact be confrontational. We have, as PowerPoint 7 shows, elements of coercion. And I would suggest that the neoliberal, primarily economic approach, which you have on a separate set of PowerPoints, with its emphasis on human capital and producing a workforce as an entity, which is about returns on investment and structural aspects, is one that tends to support particular kinds of power relations. Certainly, it has supported the development of structural aid packages, which the IMF has promoted. We are increasingly aware today of what is called gender mainstreaming approaches. By this I mean that issues of gender are no longer outside mainstream activity. Employers have to take account of gender factors. For instance, in interviews, you cannot ask one person a question that you would not put to another person. There are in many countries areas increasing such as paternity leave as well as maternity leave. There are areas where gender has become mainstream and has become a part of human development strategies. That is recognised, as PowerPoint 13 shows, in human development approaches, such as the Human Development Index from the United Nations that we have seen, and their development of a gender empowerment measure, and also the Gender Development Index. How far is a country improving the positions of gender, not just the positions of women, but gender positions in a broad sense? And you should look on some of the United Nations, the HDI web pages, to see examples of that. This points to human development approaches, and can human development approaches help reduce inequality? For assignment 2, where we are looking at social divisions, are divisions widening, and are some groups, some people losing out? Is globalisation involved in this in any way? Without going into too much detail on human development and inequalities here, what I think we can say is that different work sectors are likely to treat particular groups of workers differently. Thus, women in manufacturing occupations are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, as PowerPoint 17 shows. Similarly, a male workforce can be degraded, poorly paid, seen as not succeeding by virtue of occupation. And there are a number of multinational corporations with outlets all over the world who could certainly, it could be suggested, are in this sense degrading members of their workforce. They certainly wouldn't admit to that. Now, when we think about inequality, there is really a division between those who say that, yes, there is inequality, but the situation is improving and that gradually inequality is in decline, and those who say, wait a minute, inequality is unacceptable, it is too high, and there are areas of gross inequality which are not being addressed. Now, that's the contrast, and if you look at the admittedly quite complicated material in the finance folders on the Blackboard Resources site, you will see arguments for and against. I draw your attention now to PowerPoints 28, 29 and 30, which refer to the work of Saskia Sassen in Cities in a World Economy, because here she shows that high-tech sectors, so that includes the communications industry and all that include high levels of technology, usually as a sector also contain low-wage jobs as well. The putting together of parts in a sweatshop or in a factory are examples of that. So that while there may be strong development, particularly financial development in the technology sectors, there is increasing inequality because there are a lot of low-paid jobs. Cities have a contribution here. It is certainly argued that there is wages are higher in cities, and we have to take account of that if we're doing comparisons between countries. Another factor here is the informal economy, where money does not change hands, its goods and favours arranged in a pecking order. It's not just the city, but the city in particular is strongly involved in that, as 28, 29 and 30 bring out. We then come to the last main part of this, and that's what's called the Kuznets curve. This is controversial in some ways. It is about large-scale comparisons, but what Kuznets argued in his analysis of wage inequality is that, yes, in a society there will be an increase in inequality, which is driven by market forces. Globalisation means that we live in a strongly market-led economic environment. But he claimed to show that this inequality decreases once a certain average income is attained. This you can see in PowerPoint 37. Now, for Kuznets, we need to look over a long time scale. So, in a country, industrialisation and leaving behind agriculture will lead to inequality. But once people move to the cities, and the gap between rich and poor certainly becomes very marked, when the city becomes a higher wage employer, then such inequalities decline. But there are those who argue strongly against Kuznets. Certainly some of the analysis of, nearer to home here, the East Asian tiger performances, where state-led manufacturing and export grew quickly. At the same time, the population who are living in absolute poverty went down. So it was the opposite of what Kuznets suggested. Now, there is some material in the resources folders on Kuznets, and you may well want to consider his work. What I think that we need to think of here is, when we're looking at countries, cities are important, and cities are located within regions. And it's not just city economies, it's regional economies as well that we need to consider. And the final point is, it's not just a matter of the amount of growth, it's also about the quality of life and the quality of growth. This is recognised in the United Nations approaches, which the Human Development Index is based on capacity rather than already established achievement. So I think the question is, are social divisions enhancing, promoting capacities, or are they acting against it? Is economic globalisation, perhaps in contrast to other forms of globalisation, helping reduce inequality and strengthening social division, reducing social divisions, or is it having the opposite effect?